It's not like it was like I woke up and wanted to be an advocate. I grew up, it was actually the assault that really got me realizing that there's a lot of discrimination in Canada, in Alberta, and it propelled me to become an advocate because I used that anger and bitterness that was a result of that to fuel my advocacy work and seek out justice for a fair Alberta, fair Canada, and do my part. But I think for this talk, I'll just talk about my life and who I am and what I've been up to, and then share a little bit of my recent work. And yeah, I'll go from there. But I used to be a makeup artist. I kind of still am. I love makeup. I've been doing makeup since I was 16, playing with my auntie's makeup. I grew up in Ponoka, a small farming town just south of Edmonton, and my family's been in politics for quite some time in the local area. And I grew up with a very proud Indigenous family and a very biracial, multicultural family. My stepdad is German, and my opa too. Well, first generation, and I grew up very diverse and very respectful.
Wait, I think you're frozen.
Am I frozen?
Not for me. I can see and hear Chevi. Is everybody else okay?
Not now. It's very brief.
You're frozen for me.
Oh, now you're
Okay
frozen.
for me.
Shoot.
It's okay for me, but
Oh, now you've
Shoot.
gone.
Is it working now?
Yes.
Okay, I had to
Yes.
switch to the 5G. I realized it was on the wrong one. All right, is it working? You can hear me now?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. So I've been an advocate. Well, my background is I grew up very loved, respected. My uncle was the longest serving chief, and in Canada for over 40 years he served his tenature. And so my interactions with being Indigenous have always been about seeking out justice, rights. My grandma Sarah Shug fought for the rights of children in care her entire life, and she got the Centennial Award for that. And then my uncle sued the federal government for over land resources, and because it was like the fox guarding the henhound back then, we had a government that was basically taking our oil resources and using it to prop up other government-funded agencies. But anyways, and then using ours at a lower interest rate while propping up other state-owned assets. But that's a whole other story. So my family took them to court for 25 years, quite some time over those. And so I grew up with these very awesome pillars and watching them do great work. And then after I graduated from Red Deer College, I decided to go to U of A and then learn about Indigenous history. And I learned about residential schools, the 60s schools, things I wasn't really aware of growing up. I thought my upbringing was always about propelling rights of individuals, of First Nations and stuff like that. And so it was very heartbreaking for me to learn about the dark, traumatic history that Canada inflicted on Indigenous people. And just by the luck of the draw, my reserve happened to be on land and resources that is not the reality of a lot of the 633 First Nations. A lot of them are out of sight, out of mind. That's the way that they were designed. Out of sight, out of mind, the problem's over there. But just by luck, we got on the resources, and which wasn't that very, not much of a blessing 40 years later, because now we have high crime, we've been completely capitalized. It just a byproduct of that is now we're dealing with that, trying to survive. But the surrounding towns got a lot of money. We built up a lot of families, built up a lot of business, because there's no economic prosperity on the reserve or economic businesses back then. It was basically just propping up all of these cars cost less and with task-going kind of businesses. So when I learned about Indigenous, I realized that that was just lucky that we were born from that community, and that's not the reality of a lot of First Nations who are suffering. They don't have adequate water. They're suffering through intergenerational trauma. And I think in retrospect now, like learning that history through U of A was beneficial. It was awesome. And then I think when I got assaulted, it sparked something in me. And then I ended up going on this cool journey for almost a decade of becoming a human rights advocate. And then I learned so much about the lived experiences of Indigenous people not through an academic book, but through actually going to the front lines, advocating for the rights of individuals. And I thought that was such a valuable experience. So in retrospect, I think I can say that the assault maybe have been a blessing in disguise, because it really moved my life to a more meaningful way of giving back. Because I can say I learned all of that, but I wanted to be a famous makeup artist. I wanted to that was my goal in life. And I think now my goal seems to be very all about seeking out justice for other people who are marginalized, who don't have a voice, who are the underdogs, and using my platforms wherever it may be to raise the profile for Indigenous people who often are, so the residential schools came in, so First Nation people often go on to the reserve. They're born, so they're born into the community that's suffering through a lot of dysfunction, a lot of intergenerational caused by state-run from the effects from churches and that were state-sponsored to go and civilize the First Nation communities, but often just ended up being more traumatic experience for a lot of people. And right now, Indigenous people, the lived experiences, even for the top brass communities like Enoch and maybe a little bit of Musqueam, but it's still, those aren't the representation of all of the communities in Canada. A lot don't have adequate housing. So you have Indigenous people living up to 10 people in a home that's run down, hasn't been built properly. The system is not conducive for a healthy living environment. Your communities and families who were robbed of their culture, their identity, live in this dysfunctional bubble. And then when someone like myself, who was lucky to have an inclusive family, it's not the lived experience for a lot of other people who are gender diverse to go to the cities and then experience discrimination, hostile, aggressive hostile monitoring, I guess. And then also when they go shopping, they get followed, and then they don't have a lot of housing. There's systematic discrimination. So it's just not a healthy experience for a lot of First Nation people. I guess I should have planned a speech. I'm kind of rambling now. But basically there's I really want to highlight the housing issue, because housing should be a right. And I know that I was part of the Pan Canada Housing Women's Symposium. And through that 2 years of work, I really recognize that the housing discrimination is quite rampant. And I think Canada has a housing discrimination issue, just like every other issue that's rooted in oppressing Indigenous people. And I think, I think when the housing should be a right, and I think municipalities and provincial governments need to can make that a high priority when it comes to creating communities that are inclusive and healthy. Now I'm kind of lost now. I should have wrote on a speech, but I've been so busy and so tired, and winter's not the best month for me. I get this seasonal low where I just want to sleep all day. I'm even happy I did my makeup. But I think right now there's the housing strategy they have with the Pan Canada's Women's Association. They wanted basic income was a call to action. They wanted a number of things, but they also wanted housing as a right for Indigenous people, because there is an issue, because the overcrowding on the reserve is horrible. Has anybody here ever been to a reserve without adequate housing? You've seen how it looks. There's overcrowding, and there's so much dysfunction, and there's a crab in a bucket mentality, and there's lateral violence, and there's violence. There's just in Musqueam, there's a drive-by shooting, and then there's 2 homes targeted for being burned down. So it's not a healthy environment for people who want to prosper and live a great life. And when you go to a city or a rural town, and then you're faced with a housing manager that is very discriminatory, will write you off right away, will look at all of the, they'll look at you first, they'll judge you. And if you don't have the right syntax, you don't have the right look, you're not relatable to them, they will definitely write you off and find any excuse not for you to get home. So you'll have or you'll be put in, you'll be approved for the ghetto part. So it's just another reserve in the city where it's just another violence it's perpetuating. So I feel like lately my role has been more about trying to raise the profile on housing as a right, because you can't have healthy families without a family or roof to live or safe housing. You can't have raise families, communities without housing. You can't have employment without a housing. There's just so much. It's like the base of everything that we do in life. If you can't take care of yourself at home, and especially in winter, then how do you expect to live a decent life? And I find that there's systematic discrimination is a big barrier. So, but I'm aware that the Liberal government is doing a housing advocate that will report to the minister. It was part of the housing strategy. I know that's in the works, but I think right now, when you look in Edmonton in that 10th city there, you can see that there's like 80% are Indigenous people. Obviously, the system's not working towards Indigenous people. Obviously, there is racism that's at play here. Goes right down to the housing managers. So I just really want like the government to, I really want people to really think about making housing a priority for all Indigenous people, and actually create some kind of like organization that deals with housing for urban Indigenous people, because almost 70% of Indigenous people live off reserve now. And I think I wrote something down here the other day when I was trying to think about what I should talk about. I was so tired because it's seasonal. I think the government really needs to talk about, the Indian Affairs. I haven't seen this in any of the work that I've been doing. Indian Affairs needs to adopt the UN Declaration of Rights, or at least, its own version, because they manage the lives of Indigenous people from cradle to grave. And I think that should be a top priority for governments. I think I'm good for rambling now. Does anybody have any questions? So I wear so many different hats. So there's also a gender identity. I've been advocating for inclusive cities, lobbying the government, municipalities, for creating inclusive gender identity, advocating for people like myself who are gender diverse. Right now, I just connected with Rainbow Connect. It's the first online digital business. We promote inclusive businesses that's safe and welcome, and it's the first of its kind. It just got announced this week. And so I'm always doing different things, but that's where my mind was for this. I was like, I need to really talk about housing as a right, because you can't really talk about anything if you can't house the people that these organizations say they're trying to help. If you can't house anybody, then that's not a marker of success.
Thank you, Chevi. I think lots of us have questions. Everybody looks very attentive. I posted in the chat, just from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, point 25 does include the right to housing. And that's something that I would like to find an article from the Alberta Human Rights Code, but I haven't found it yet. I was searching while you were talking, but I didn't see that. And John might know better about it as well. But I really wanted to ask you about the Pekiwewan tent city in Edmonton, and you touched on that a little bit. I think I'd like to hear your perspective more on, I volunteered down there. I tried to help out as much as I could while they were still camped down there. But do you know much about what the city's response has been?
I think they hired, I know because my friend Sebastian Bork got hired from the Bissell Center to handle the intake. He was contracted out. I think the city, what they did is they did a really good approach, as they partnered with the Mustard Seed, the Bissell Center, and a couple other organizations to house them temporarily. But I think there needs to be more housing inventory, or there needs to be more of a priority on zoning or whatever the city can do, its bylaws, and to create more housing. Because I think temporarily housing people is like such a nice thing, but I think actually providing stable long-term housing would be the more appropriate response, and using that money. But I know the camp has been cleaned up, or it has not been cleaned up, but I guess it has been. Yeah, it has been cleaned up. But they have been moved out and shipped off. But I think there's still a lot of homelessness. Because I know I did Gift of Warm campaign, and a lot of people who were showing up there said they're just wandering the city without any homes. And I'm like, there must be a way the state can like invest all those millions into like affordable housing for people. But the camp was really effective, and I know that some of the organizers were on an operational budget of 30,000. When you have other organizations with massive budgets, they were able to do quite a bit with the little. That's because they're passionate about it. So when you have passionate people who want to make a difference, and you give them those kind of funds, even little, they'll take it a long way, because they're not there to pay for their cars or their children's private schools. They're there to do a good job and get the work done. They're not there for a paycheck. So there's a big difference between how they were run. They were there because they wanted to make a difference. That's the impression I got. Because I stopped down a few times to drop off donations that I picked up and grabbed around my community and my family, and dropped off coats, dropped off what I can. But I found them to be very passionate, like really hardcore passionate people who want to make a difference, who don't have to help if they don't want to. Their lives are okay, but they wanted to make a difference. And I think when you look at those kind of camps, that's the byproduct of aggressive assimilation. That's what you get. So if you want to look at the success rate of residential schools, just look at the streets of Edmonton, and you'll see what was the byproduct of those years. A lot of people are damaged. Yeah, there is some successful people, and then people who want to target or highlight the success of that era, they can easily prop up that 1% of people who got whose families were positively impacted. But what about the 98% that are traumatized and living through trauma? So yeah, so if you just look on Edmonton streets, you'll see that obviously the residential schools in the 60s scoops was not beneficial. And I know because my dad and my family and them were part of. My dad got murdered when I was 1 year old, and I had a stepdad ever since then. Grateful they've been loving and accepting. So I lucked out there again. But but my auntie is missing murdered. She was hogtied and thrown in a river. She's part Marlene Curry. I learned about this as an adult. I learned about my dad's side. It's very traumatic. And the 60 scoop came in there, swooped them up because they were biracial kids with green eyes, and they were well sought after. So they got families, and then they turned 18, they got shoved out, and then often ended up missing and murdered or missing. My uncle Frank Curry's been on a missing list for a long time. He has the largest state trust fund governed by the Indian Act, and we're currently going through a number of lawsuits because there's our family, that's what happens when there's a lot of money involved. But it obviously wasn't healthy. Nothing was very. All of the programs have not been very healthy. So yeah, so to that answer is on the streets, that's the byproduct of aggressive assimilation. That's residential schools right there.
Are there any other questions?
I don't really have a question, but I'd love to connect with you outside, because I worked on, for the last 4 years, I worked on rural and remote homelessness and housing across Alberta. And so I've seen the overcrowding issues firsthand through my work. And it's just like, it's really shocking. We're basically, as a country, and this is actually like probably North America, like Canada and US, we're like 25 years behind in housing development, perhaps more. Sorry, you look like you were going to say something there.
No, it just triggered something in my memory. Like, yeah, 2019, November 2nd was Canada actually adopted its first national housing strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So we are way behind on a lot of things. So Canada gloats on our high standards of human rights, but I feel like sometimes it's like a show.
Yeah. And I was just actually in a talk yesterday. So I still work in homelessness and housing systems, but my role's changed a bit. And I was in a talk yesterday on Thursday, where they mentioned that it was an anti-Indigenous racism forum, and they were talking about how the housing gap, just for First Nations in Canada, the housing gap is $40 billion. So that's the entire cost, like the the national housing strategy for all of Canada is $40 billion, but the gap right now with only First Nations would be $40 billion, not even considering, the rest of the country. So it's really like a shocking, we're shockingly behind on housing rights.
Yeah.
So I completely hear you on that.
So definitely, yeah, I'll connect with you outside of this because I find
Sure.
like my passion has been about housing lately because I find after like advocating for all of these rights, and then I was advocating on a reserve for gender identity rights, and then when I had a chance to work for the community, I realized I'm like, oh, you don't even have basic rights yet. You're not even there yet. How can we have to like focus on the fundamentals before we can go and start working on stuff? But and then I'm like, then there's housing issues, and even the wealthiest communities have housing issues. There's just we're so far behind on everything, and I think like there's not only housing, land-based issues. There's this all of the issues. There's so many fires that you can just pick and choose one and then spend your whole life trying to make a difference.
So I have a question for Chevi. Rob here. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission a few years back published its landmark report, and it was headed up by Murray Sinclair. So there were quite a large number of recommendations for reconciliation. I don't know specifically what they might have said about housing, but I would like to just ask, what are some of the ways that you've seen in your work that the rest of Canada can can work at reconciliation with Indigenous peoples?
That's a good question. So I think read the documents and then figure out which ones will can apply because they're all thought out. There's a Truth and Reconciliation, then there's the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report, and then lately there's the government working group government did a report for gender diverse and missing and murdered women with Rick Wilson, and I was a part of that, was finding recommendations on how to implement them. But I think every community is different. Everything has their own needs, but I would say just read through all of the articles and find which ones work, and then start from there. But I think what people can do for municipalities and provincial, federal, is start prioritizing like the most vulnerable rights of the community, and then figuring out ways you can implement them. So I think just investing in new housing inventory, writing your municipality to change zoning and bylaws, because that's what they can do from the city level. I think provincially you could elect a government that will spend more money on housing. But I think that's what you can basically do. There's a lot for Truth and Reconciliation. I don't know. I'm really tired right now.
Just as a follow-up, it seems I know the city of Edmonton does have have Indigenous an Indigenous department, if you will, for urban Indigenous peoples. Is there something there that they could expand on in terms of a program if Indigenous people come, let's say, from a reserve into the city, into Edmonton, into Calgary, wherever? But speaking again, thinking of Edmonton, is there some program? Can they look to some kind of organization that would at least find them a place initially, maybe work on getting them, the preconditions for getting into their own house?
I think there's a lot of different organizations out there that can help. There's Capital Housing, a few other ones, but I think if you want to make an actual difference, I made a recommendation during the last call to actions, is like maybe invest in housing owned by First Nations and led by First Nations. So, and like equity in housing. So what I'm saying is like a First Nation community or a group of them can collectively own a housing organization through CMHC funding, and then by that, and then that would get rid of the systematic discrimination. That will set up job employment for Indigenous people because they would have employment, and then there would be the cultural aspects would be automatically implemented into there. And if you can create like a two or three tier system, one for active users or people who are on drugs, and then house them on there, and then slowly put them into like palm makers or some kind of healthy organization, and another tier system for students and people who are transitioning from the reserve to go seek out school, or or invest. CMHC can invest in home ownership by the community, where they can buy up homes like for the students going there. Like it would have been beneficial if I was going to school and then went into a home owned by the community I was in, and then funneled that money back and recycled it back to community, so that I would be paying my rent, but it'd be going back to a First Nation owned home. That way it would keep on recycling the money instead of it always filtered out. That would help a community with sustainability over a long term. And also, I think if like say if the five reserves around here, if they all partnered and created with a developer and then owned a massive building for Indigenous people all over the city, not group them up because it would turn into a ghetto or some kind of like District 9 kind of thing. But I think just like split them up all over, and then having it owned by the reserve would be amazing, because they would have equity, in the long-term equity. They would have stay over First Nations home ownership. And then I think another lens could be also expanding on existing things of low-income housing ownership. I think it was Habitat for Humanity was big back in a while, where you got people who with low income able to buy. I think spending on those kind of big programs. But I honestly think right now, First Nation owned housing, like apartment housing, low income housing, would be the best solution. It would fix a lot of issues. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of nonprofits. You pick them. I'm a board on a couple of nonprofits in Edmonton on Indigenous women. Everybody's trying to do something. They all just need funding.
Thank you so much, Chevi. That was so much information. And I know you felt like you were rambling, but it was great to hear your thoughts.
Oh, I ramble. That's why I need to like make notes. But when I'm really tired, like winter, I have seasonal lows. And I'm like foggy brain. I have to like make little notes now of everything. I'm like, oh yeah, wash your hair today.
Just on a different tack, Chevi, well, being the father of a transgender daughter, I just wondered how you're being a person, or a gender diverse person, how that has impacted on your other advocacy work, like your advocacy with housing. Do you find it more difficult, or do you find people are generally accepting? Because I mean, I know there's a lot of anti-trans
Yeah, I think there's a lot of
feeling out there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of anti-trans, and I've been lucked out. I don't know if people are trying to treat me nice on purpose. I don't know. But I feel like that's not the lived experience of a lot of people. And I have faced discrimination, but it hasn't been that much. I was assaulted. That was the first time I've experienced discrimination. But I've been really lucky to have a family that was very inclusive and very rights orientated. And so I was well skilled up to advocate for myself anywhere. But through the work, there is no good transgender or adequate housing programs. That's what we found. And there needs to be more investment. And also, if there needs to be housing appropriate for two-spirit transgender individuals who want to practice their culture in safe ways. Because often what you'll find is a lot of transgender two-spirit people facing discrimination. So if a community is completely colonized or completely impacted in a negative way from residential schools, and they have rigid gender norms, they'll often push out gender diverse people into the communities, and then they'll face discrimination there. And in the cities, they'll end up on escapism through drugs and alcohol abuse, prostitution, and sex work to survive, because they're on a fringe of society. And there is no appropriate funding. They're not prioritized in housing, and they're not given the respect and dignity in most places. So that's part of my work. I feel like the housing thing is, I think that's the core, but I think just advocating for a safe, inclusive province and communities has been very taxing and very hard to do, because I always find like all these different meetings with different people, I'm like, oh, these are nice words, oh, let's say it another. How many times do you have to ask for inclusivity before they actually take those words and put them into action when a policymaker says, okay, let's make a difference? Because I think for me, advocating for a safe, inclusive province for almost a decade, 10 years, almost a decade, when is the change going to happen? You know, how many groups and how many governments do I have to talk to about change? I mean, when does it actually start to grow?
Yeah, it certainly takes time. Thanks.
Yeah. And I'm like, just speed it up so I can live, so people like myself can just live an amazing life, live self-actualized, you know, have a job, have our families, not walk into a community and everybody has their eyes on you, or everybody's has these different stereotype, a negative narrative of who you are. Sometimes you just want to go and buy some groceries without not having to deal with this onslaught of feeling that you're being judged or discrimination.
You want to be able to get groceries without it being a political act?
Yeah, exactly. I feel like everything I'm doing
Yeah.
is political. I feel like I'm always on display. Even in like, I think advocating in a public arena has been okay and fun, but I find it has now micromanaged my behavior. Like, they know who I am now, so everybody's aware. So living in a small community in rural Alberta, everybody is aware. And then writing for the paper, people are aware.
Yeah, a friend of mine who is a psychologist and counsels transgender people, well, youth mostly, thinks that it might be about 15 years before transgender people are going to be accepted like in a similar way than gay and lesbian, which well, is still obviously discrimination.
But there is hope. There is hope. I can say that the people who once made fun of people who are transgender and got more education and awareness have changed their tune. There are some people that are more inclusive, so it's not fully there, and it's not entering into all of the systems like housing, all of the organized business and stuff, but it's there, and there is sparks of hope everywhere. It's on its way. It's just, for me, I'm like, just hurry up.
Yeah, exactly. My daughter says the same thing.
You have an email we could reach you at?
Yeah, it's rabbitt@ualberta.ca. And it's Rabbitt, just like rabbit@ualberta.ca. But I find, like, I advocate a lot, and right now it's all about housing, because housing is really a priority for Indigenous people, people of color, racialized groups, transgender folks, because we can't live a good life if you don't have housing. You can't do anything. You can't build, you can't do nothing with your life, because you're just going to get your basic needs met. So you need to make sure the housing, so then the communities that are racialized, that marginalized and discriminated against, can start building good lives. And it starts with a base, and that's your housing.
And I think it's become even more apparent during the pandemic.
Yeah, it basically exacerbated already existing issues. It just highlighted it now. It's not like it just popped up. It was there the whole time.
Thank you so much, Chevi. I think we've gone a little over time, which don't worry, all of our guests today have gone over time, so you're not the only one. But you've created a really energetic discussion here, and we're so grateful for that. And I hope we'll have a chance to meet with you again or talk with you again where we have a little bit more time.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. So if I rambled, but I'm really tired, and winter's not my month. I don't even know why I live here.
No, that's fine, Chevi. Thanks a lot.
Yes.